Hello, History72B Spring Quarter 2023. This is my third take for this lecture because my computer keeps crashing. So if I sound a little grumpy during the lecture, you know why. Wish me luck. This lecture is the last lecture for Package B, Enforcing Sex and Race in the U.S. by Controlling Family Structure. I'm dividing this lecture, I'm calling it The Uncertainty of Whiteness, and I'm dividing it into 4 parts, but don't panic. The last 3 in particular are short. The 4 parts are a different shade of whiteness, not acting white, Italian Americans in the U.S. South, suspicious physiognomy, the story of Leo Frank, controlling errant white women, Helen Gladys Emery, and Gunjiro Aoki. The privileged place of whiteness is quite literally as old as the country. The law on the slide was written before the time period of our class, but it was the only naturalization law on the books when our class begins. We saw the 14th Amendment define birthright citizenship and refer to naturalization, but not define it. So this law is quite relevant to our discussion of immigration, even as we move to European immigration to the East Coast of the United States in the second half of the 19th century, the 1800s. This is the 1790 Naturalization Act, defining who could come from another country but then become naturalized as an American citizen. You can see that the 2 principal qualities that a potential citizen had to have were whiteness and freedom. So no one serving a term of indenture, even if they were white. And I'll read it for those of you who are listening and not watching. Any alien being a free white person, literally says that, who shall have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years may be admitted to become a citizen thereof. Benjamin Franklin, in response to German immigration to Pennsylvania, had already started to feel white defensiveness, and he wondered whether Germans were actually white. He wrote, in Europe, the Spaniards, Italians, French, Russians, and Swedes are generally of what we call a swarthy complexion, as are the Germans also. The Saxons only accepted who, with the English, make the principal body of white people on the face of the earth. I could wish their numbers were increased. Note my last name is German, and I am ever so swarthy. This pattern of redefining whiteness would be repeated with every wave of immigrants from Europe. Like Asian immigrants, each group faced a different set of challenges, but unlike Asian immigrants, each group of European immigrants was able to join the white group once the next set of Europeans arrived. Notice Franklin's use of Saxons as a separate group of Germans here. Anglo means English, hence Angleland or England. Although, like the Saxons, Angles were barbarian invaders to the British Isles as the Roman Empire lost control. The only part of that you need to remember is that Anglo-Saxon is a mythical mixture of supposedly pure English and pure Teutonic. Anglo-Saxon as a term first appeared in racist discourse written in 1859. So right before the time period of this class, the term began to be used to try to distinguish top-tier whiteness from lower-order whiteness. Notice that both the top tier and the lowest order of whiteness were still accorded a place of privilege relative to Black and Asian populations. The Irish experienced prejudice in the U.S., but nothing comparable to that faced by African Americans and Asian Americans. Anglo-Saxon was used to distinguish one white group from the Irish, who are classed as Celts or Celts if you prefer, and lesser to Anglo-Saxons, although still within the overarching white category. Scholar Matthew Fry Jacobson has noted this racial refinement from white to Anglo-Saxon is neither accidental nor idiosyncratic. Rather, it reflects a political revision of whiteness in New England during the 2 decades bracketing the famine in Ireland. and the tremendous Celtic exodus to North America. The famine, or as it is generally referred to in the U.S., the Irish potato famine, lasted from 1845 to 1852. During this time, staple potato crops failed, and the Irish were left without food, a situation that tends to go with outbreaks of disease because of low resistance. Somewhere around 1 million Irish people died. Another 1 million immigrated, many of them to the United States. So we're not talking about a small influx of immigrants here. White Americans who now classed themselves as Anglo-Saxons or white Anglo-Saxons, just to double down on the power structure, had much the same response to the Irish as they had to Asian immigrants. Employers welcomed the influx of poor, desperate European immigrants. The Northeast and the Great Lakes region were industrializing quickly and drastically, and the demand for cheap wage labor rose accordingly. At the same time, U.S.-born working-class white folks saw the Irish as a threat to their own work and wages, and they were correct to be concerned, but it was the Irish who bore the brunt of their resentment rather than employers who were shielded by wealth and power. Employers, in turn, saw the Irish as a political threat, again with some cause, as the Irish formed large voting blocs in cities like New York and Boston. Employers were perfectly happy to keep the Irish as a desperate, impoverished labor base, willing to take any work for low wages and isolated from other parts of the working class. One possible response to the situation of poverty and ill usage was that the Irish could have found common cause with African American laborers, but that is not what happened. In general, the Irish doubled down on claiming whiteness by denigrating African Americans. We saw the draft riots of 1863 near the beginning of the course, in which white rioters in New York City destroyed a Black neighborhood, murdering over 100 of the Black residents. A fair number of both rioters and instigators were either directly from Ireland or first generation, born in the U.S. Like the U.S., Europe was industrializing rapidly. The U.S. displaced and killed Native Americans in order to facilitate this growth. Europe displaced a peasant class and mostly allowed the excess people who couldn't find industrial work to starve. In some cases, direct violence was added to this. For example, the English in Ireland and the pogroms of Russia, and I will explain pogroms later in the lecture. The result was waves of European immigration to the U.S. These may not seem like big numbers on the slide to us now, but remember what the U.S. looked like in the years listed here, 1851 to 1907. All of these numbers, number of immigrants, are for a single year, not total overall. And almost all of the people represented passed through the port city of New York. While the sequential immigration looked similar to immigration to the West Coast from Asia, the results were quite different for immigrants from Asia versus Europe. White Anglo-Saxon Americans spoke of both Asian immigrants and immigrants from East and South Europe as being unassimilable. They couldn't become American and incapable of self-government. Asians were excluded entirely by 1924, while European immigration was limited by quotas but not cut off entirely. Another major difference was that there were not anti-miscegenation laws between the parts of fractured whiteness, like the ones applied to African Americans and Asian Americans to prevent marriage to white women. We've seen already that humans insist on being human and having children with one another. It was difficult to distinguish who was pure Anglo-Saxon and who was polluted by a lesser form of whiteness. Last names will only allow separation based on the father's extraction, not the mother's. So what to do? England helped solve the problem. They favored religion as an exclusionary category. Since the Reformation, and don't worry if you don't know the Reformation, but if you do, most English were Protestant, mainly Anglican. So-called Anglo-Saxon Americans were also generally Protestant, although split between a number of different brands of Protestantism. Nevertheless, religion became another excuse for prejudice and abuse as weapons to establish white supremacy. This also is where we get the term WASP, which you may or may not have seen used in current political debates. And I will use this abbreviation because it's much quicker to say WASP than White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. If you don't know Irish history, you are about to get a whirlwind tour. If you do know Irish history, you will be shocked by the whirlwind nature of the tour. England had been trying to take over Ireland well before the potato famine. The Irish had been resisting, but they took a major hit during the famine, and the English were not averse to taking advantage. The English had become Protestants with the Reformation 3 centuries earlier, but the Irish had not. Most of Ireland remained Catholic, but control of Irish land and money went to England and Protestants. This meant that most of the starving Irish who arrived in America were Catholic. The English wrote anti-Irish screeds that were eagerly picked up by WASP America. For example, the quote on the slide, and I will apologize for it before I read it, as well as for the American 19th century cartoon that accompanies the quote here. The native Irish are, and this is the quote, pot-bellied, bow-legged, and abortively featured, and they are especially remarkable for open, projecting mouths with prominent teeth and exposed gums, their advancing cheekbones and depressed noses bearing barbarism on the very front. The poor Irish represent a diseased stock. And by poor there, the writer was not meaning in sympathy, but those without money. There is an attempt here to construct an inferior white race based less on skin tone than on physical shape and presentation or physiognomy. The Irish were also presented as papists, or papists if you prefer, a pejorative term for Catholics, and they were presented as violent, dangerous alcoholics, and you can see that in the image shown here. We will be looking more at the supposed racial sciences of the era in the next lecture package, so I will set that aside for the moment. It is patently obvious that the image on the last slide is a caricature. So what did WASPs actually see and fear? These are ships with immigrants from the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And if you can't see it, these are people standing shoulder to shoulder, both above deck and below deck. The people are not gathered to look out while strolling. They are packed in like that, above and below decks, and travel that way for the entire voyage. They paid passage to travel in what is called steerage, which basically meant you can get on the ship, but you must find your own space. And if there are wealthy folks on board, you are not to be seen or heard. These are smallest ships shown in the slide that only include immigrants, but large liners would sell steerage passages at the bottom of the ship. When the Titanic went down, so did close to 550 of the 700 passengers in steerage, including 52 of the 53 children who died. But back to what WASPs saw in the sheer number of people arriving. Immigrants coming in were desperately poor and arriving in an economy centered on money. WASP employers saw cheap, expendable labor. The white working class saw competition for jobs from a group that would depress wages. Moreover, in the case of the Irish, people with unfamiliar and a vilified religion. As long as the labor force stayed poor, wealthy WASPs didn't really fear the influx of Irish, but they were happy to stoke the fears of the working class. The Irish entered the U.S. often as families, and families characterized as having numerous children, regardless of what the fact of the matter might be. Nevertheless, many, if not most, Irish people became fully white within a couple of generations as other European groups arrived. German immigration was received quite differently. Most Germans did not stay in the already industrialized East. They moved west to places like Ohio and Wisconsin, where they did things like brew beer. Many WASPs, well post Benjamin Franklin, viewed Germans as Teutonic and therefore white. It helped that German immigrants were creating jobs and not taking them. For their part, German immigrants didn't really view themselves as a unified race. Some spoke Northern German and some Southern. Many were Protestant, but some were Catholic. Between heading for whatever frontier was open and settling in smaller communities that were less inclined to worry about anyone else, German immigrants absorbed with relative ease into whiteness. The Irish, unlike the Germans, settled in places like New York and Boston, and they embraced their identification as Celts or Celts rather than Anglo-Saxons, which is how we end up with a sports ball team called the Boston Celtics or the Boston Celtics. For the Irish, it was a matter of asserting national identity, and the racial designation was simply a means to an end. Italian immigration represents yet another story of sub-white racial construction, especially in the South. Italian immigration is often associated with New York or New Jersey, places relatively close to the entry point of Ellis Island. New Orleans, however, had been a multinational city from its beginnings. Founded by the French, it had been held by the Spanish, the French again, and the United States. New Orleans had been home to multiple groups of Native Americans, to African Americans enslaved and free, and to sailors from around the globe. The upshot was that when Italian immigration began in earnest in the 1880s, there was enough of an Italian American community in New Orleans to attract newer immigrants. The wave of immigrants that came from Italy at the turn of the century came from the south of the peninsula and from Sicily. They were largely poor and mainly farmers. Italy did not become a single nation until 1861 or 1871 if you include Rome and Venice. Waves of war and natural disasters like earthquakes had exacerbated poverty in southern Italy. Although there were families who came, a significant proportion of Italians who arrived in the U.S. between 1880 and 1920 were young men. Their plan was never to settle in the U.S., but to make money and go back home. And indeed, somewhere around 40% of Italian immigrants in those years did just that. Some of them would actually make repeat voyages to the United States, but end up going back home. New Orleans was cosmopolitan, but it was still in the Jim Crow South. Italians occupied a sort of racial middle ground in the U.S. South. Politically, they were white enough to enter the country, and for those who stayed to become naturalized citizens. But in the Jim Crow world, they were ranked socially only slightly above African Americans. It was not just that they looked a bit swarthy, to use Benjamin Franklin's description, but that they broke the unspoken Jim Crow social codes. Italian Americans accepted economic labor marked as Black, like farm labor. What was more, they had no problem working side by side with Black people. The last straw for white supremacists was that Italian Americans who settled in the South intermarried with their Black neighbors. In accord with these sentiments, Italian Americans were lynched in states like Louisiana, Mississippi, and West Virginia. The most extreme case of lynching occurred in New Orleans in 1891. The white chief of police, David Hennessy, was murdered. And I will say at the outset that we don't know who murdered him, so you don't spend time wondering who did it. Hennessy was an Irish American, and Irish and Italian Americans had butted heads in the U.S. South, not least because the Irish were busy becoming white, and Italians, with their cavalier attitude toward U.S. racial codes, were equally busy not caring and potentially undermining Irish efforts. Hennessy was Irish American, and 11 Italian immigrants were arrested in a hectic sweep to find the murderer, or at least to find someone to punish. When it came to the trial, all 11 were acquitted. New Orleans went nuts. Many white New Orleans went nuts. Many claimed that the trial had been fixed by the mafiosi. The result was that members of the local White League, a terrorist organization like the KKK, backed by a huge crowd, battered their way into the local jail, extracted the 11 exonerated men, and lynched them. Southern newspapers cast this action as a form of chivalry and manliness, while Italian observers both inside and outside of the US pointed out that lynching was what those in the mob and Southern editorialists would consider barbaric if anyone but themselves had done it. The US national press speculated not so much about the mob, but rather about those lynched, tossing out theories that perhaps Italians were innately criminal and could not be otherwise. Remember, these men had been judged innocent. By forming families with Black people and by existing socially in a middle space in a segregated South, Italian Americans had threatened to expose the strict U.S. racial binary as an aspect of white society, not biological reality. I'm going to use another example of lynching from the South to illustrate the way that anti-Semitism this time worked as an othering simultaneously related to and distinct from the racial othering that WASPs visited upon what they considered clearly non-white racial constructions. I specified Russian Jews earlier because that is what I had numbers for, but for many Jews across Eastern Europe, escape was a necessity. I've given you 3 definitions of pogrom here to give you an idea of what these people were fleeing. So, pogrom, an organized massacre of a particular ethnic group, in particular that of Jewish people in Russia or Eastern Europe in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The second definition of pogrom, a violent riot incited with the aim of massacring or expelling an ethnic or religious group, particularly Jews. And the third one, an organized massacre of helpless people, specifically such a massacre of Jews. Leo Frank was a young Jewish American. He had been born in Texas to immigrant parents and raised in New York, and he was a Cornell graduate. Cornell is also your instructor's alma mater, just on the side. Frank studied mechanical engineering and took over the management of a pencil factory in Georgia, of which he was also part owner. In 1913, the employment of children in factories was not uncommon, and the pencil factory employed one Mary Fagan. The daughter of tenant farmers, she had moved to Atlanta to try to earn money, hence the job at the pencil factory. The image here makes her look like a grown woman, but in point of fact, she was 13 years old. In April of 1913, her body was found in the basement of the factory. She had been raped and murdered, probably beaten to death. As with the Hennessy murder in New Orleans, we still don't know who murdered Fagan. So no convincing person caught. We don't know if it's the person convicted or not. Initially, the Black night watchman who discovered her body was arrested, and then Jim Conley, a Black janitor. Conley pointed the finger at Leo Frank, and Frank was arrested. Conley became the prime witness for the prosecution. Now, that tells you something in and of itself. As in Jim Crow, Georgia, Black people could not give evidence against white defendants. As a Jew, Leo Frank did not qualify as entirely white. One newspaper in particular, the Jeffersonian, went on the attack against Leo Frank, drawing attention to the fact that Frank was Jewish and linking that as if it were natural to charges that he was a pervert who liked boys. The newspaper interpreted Frank's physical appearance as a sign both of his Jewishness and of his perversion, and then put the two together. This was not unique. It fed into a long-standing stereotype, Jewish men as lechers. Other newspapers followed suit, if not to the degree of the Jeffersonian, enough to keep presenting Frank's Jewishness as if it were a feature that should be considered by the public in its judgment of him. I've put a really dreadful quote on the slide, which I will not read. This has reached my limit. But I do want to draw your attention to several bits. The use of the word racial when applied to Jewish here, the reference to the North, carpetbaggers and people who came in not native to the South initially, and the suggestion of danger to white womanhood. Lynchings of Black men in the Jim Crow South were often attributed to a supposed danger to white women, even if everyone knew this was a lie, even as they said it. The excuse was that Black people were barbaric and could not control themselves. In the case of Jewish men, the rationale was just the opposite. Their over-civilization made them into effete lechers and perverts. Leo Frank was convicted to the howls of a crowd and sentenced to die. The outgoing governor of Georgia reviewed the case and commuted the penalty from death to imprisonment, assuming that would give time to reconsider the case once the atmosphere of extreme racism and anti-Semitism had abated somewhat. The former governor was escorted to the Georgia state line and told not to return. Leo Franks was kidnapped from prison and hanged. This was an all-round losing situation for the poor in both senses of the word girl and the accused Black and Jewish men. The only ones who profited were the WASP mob. It was also a case in which power was glaringly linked to intertwined categories of race, sex, class, and age. While there were promises to punish those who carried out the lynching, you will be unsurprised to hear that did not happen. In fact, the main actors in the lynching of Leo Frank would, only months later, take part in a secret nighttime ceremony that is considered the establishment of the 20th century version of the Ku Klux Klan. Before I start the next section, a caution. I've used articles from Turn to the 20th Century newspapers, as well as the wording of actual anti-miscegenation law. And these include problematic images and text. I've tried to choose the least worst of these, but they remain disturbing. I don't read them aloud, so you may choose to listen rather than to watch. If the South turned to lynching to keep threats to WASP whiteness in check and to demonstrate the power of the WASP male, the West was more inclined to address the white woman concern when it came to marriages to Asian men that threatened to produce white-seeming children. The press had played a major part in the vilification of Leo Frank. It played an even bigger part in drawing attention to and shaming white women who married Asian men. These stories, in turn, led to ever more elaborate miscegenation laws. Initially written to prevent Chinese white marriage, keeping Chinese men othered. Remember, very few Chinese women were allowed to the US. The laws were expanded in attempts to include Japanese, Filipino, and South Asian men. The 1911 law from Nevada, shown on the slide, was perhaps the most expansive of these. And again, if you want to read it, you'll have to look at the slide. Newspaper miscegenation dramas, as they were called, appeared as moralistic tales that provided entertainment to a white audience spanning the United States. They followed a set pattern, all of them. Starting from an actual marriage, the journalists supposedly followed up and found the young wife destitute as her philandering husband had moved on. The stories made marriage and thus sex between Asian men and white women seem like a perversion in and of itself, rather than an ordinary marriage between a couple of ordinary people. The stories were titillatory in a way not unlike rape scenes in American movies in the 1970s and 80s, in which the woman then had to die to advance the plot. These women didn't die, but the moralistic tale cast them as innocent but stupid victims bound to a life of misery. While the press did present actual weddings in the miscegenation dramas, the follow-up was often in the form of a friend of yours truly has heard that, and then the moral of inevitable misery. In other words, the couples were real. The long-term failure of their marriages was questionable at best. Of all of these, the most famous was the marriage of Helen Gladys Emery, the daughter of a California Episcopal archdeacon, to Gunjiro Aoki, a young Japanese immigrant. The article on the slide here is about that marriage, and notice the headline asks if the young woman has been hypnotized, because how else could she want to link her life to a man not classified as white? In other words, how could she sully the purity of her offspring? Aoki and Emery had originally planned to be married in San Francisco, but publicity led to no one being willing to issue them a marriage license. The press literally followed the couple up the West Coast, reporting in every town on every refusal they received until they were finally wed in Seattle, and newspaper sales soared across the U.S. I am going to end this lecture and package B with a quote from historian Peggy Pascoe that encapsulates what we have been discussing in these last few lectures. Like post-Civil War Southern politicians unsettled by the need to recognize marriages of freed slaves, Western politicians considered access to marriage and family formation an index of American liberty and citizenship rights. Like legislators all across America, they conflated the families of white citizens with the American national family. He points to Lecture 7 in Module B. White Anglo-Saxon Protestants have questioned whether non-English-speaking Europeans were really white from at least Benjamin Franklin. During rapid industrialization in North America and Europe, the United States welcomed millions of impoverished laborers from Europe into the workforce, while vilifying them socially. White Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or WASP, was a designation used to distinguish English immigrants and their descendants from Celts, the Irish, and I didn't say it in the lecture, but the Welsh. Unlike Asian immigrants, many, but not all European immigrants were eventually absorbed into the category white, even if it took several generations. Italian immigrants held a position in the American South between white and Black. Male Italian immigrants accepted labor coded as Black and intermarried with Black communities. One mode of terrorist control used by white supremacists was the lynching of Italian American and Jewish men in the U.S. South, eliminating the supposed intermediate category that gave lie to a strict Black-white racial binary. Now, by eliminating, I don't mean that they killed them all. I mean that they made people keep their heads down. In the American press, Jewish men were presented as over-civilized perverts preying on WASP women. The ideas of perversion and threats to white womanhood were used to vilify all members of interracial marriages. White women who married Asian men were made out to be foolish creatures misled by crafty, quote, alien men. The U.S. used anti-miscegenation laws to control marriage and family structure. This interference in partnership and family formation, in turn, served to make constructed races seem natural and unions between them seem perverse. The coda for this lecture is short. If I have hope after studying history, it does not come from a belief in some inchoate progress, but in the consistent and ongoing ability of people to love one another in whatever form that is actually a through line in history. Not all people, but enough.